Gordie Howe was a hockey player back in the day, and Bart cut his picture out of a magazine and then mailed it to Mrs. Krabappel when he was like writing fake love letters to her, and that was who he pretended he was. And then on the top here, that's supposed to be John A. Macdonald, who was the first Prime Minister of Canada.
The science textbooks acknowledge climate change.
So the book is called Science by Scientists. This is really sort of more of an American joke. You can see that the textbook says not available in Texas. This is a reference to the fact that Texas is one of the major sort of textbook buying states in the US because its population is so large. And so as a result, the argument has long been that textbook manufacturers kind of have to appease sort of Texan sensibilities and the sensibilities of the Texan government, which is of course very conservative. And so as a result, you know, things like climate change and evolution and, you know, communism and whatever are sort of massaged in their presentation in a way that is sort of acceptable to kind of, you know, the Republican ethos.
Class, let's give an enthusiastic but quiet hello to Lisa Simpson.
Hello. As an American, I'd like to apologize for something our president said about your wonderfully progressive prime minister. Is there any way I can send a note, or maybe I could...
Right this way.
Oh.
I don't really know what this is getting at, like this idea that somehow in Canada it's very easy to get in touch with the prime minister. I mean, I guess compared to America it is, just because Canada is much smaller, but it's kind of an odd thing.
I am really sorry about what our president called you.
I don't think about it. I've moved on. Weak. He called me weak.
Absolutely.
To start with, the depiction of the Prime Minister's office is very accurate. That's very much what it looks like. But this joke here is kind of based on a bit of a false premise. You know, it is true that Donald Trump often made fun of foreign leaders and said very insulting things about them on Twitter. But that wasn't really the case with Justin Trudeau. Trudeau and Trump actually seem to have a mostly amicable relationship in comparison to some other relationships he had with world leaders. This tweet that they're referencing is, I think, actually one of the only times that Trump said something explicitly mean to Trudeau, certainly at the time that this episode would have been made. The other thing I know is that I believe that they wanted to get the actual Trudeau to do the voice here. Currently serving world leaders have made cameos in The Simpsons before. I know Tony Blair appeared in the Britain episode.
Hello, welcome to the United Kingdom.
Prime Minister Tony Blair?
But when they couldn't get the real Trudeau for whatever reason, they went with a Trudeau impersonator instead, who was actually very talented. He has some very funny videos on YouTube.
Let me ask you, does this look weak?
Seriously? Wow, that is impressive. Watch your tie.
So this is a reference to a viral photo of Trudeau from some years ago. You know, Trudeau is known for being a fit man, and he likes to do little stunts, and apparently one of the stunts he can do is sort of elevate himself by his hands in this way. It was, the picture is somewhat controversial, of course, because, you know, Trudeau's propensity to engage in sort of clowning has sort of angered a lot of people who are always like, whenever they see pictures like this, it's like, get back to work, Trudeau.
So listen, if I could just ask you one question about the SNC Lavalin scandal.
So that's another very accurate depiction. That's what the Prime Minister's building looks like, the building where the Prime Minister works in Ottawa. And the thing that Lisa asks him about, the SNC Lavalin scandal, that was a real political scandal of some years ago. I made a whole other video about it. The reference feels a little dated now, just because I think that the scandal didn't do quite as much damage to Trudeau as it would have been expected, perhaps, when this was made.
Now, Lisa, we'll be doing a class play based on a great Canadian novel.
The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz by Mordecai Rickler?
Maybe next year, Oliver.
It's never Duddy.
So the joke here is that The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz is like this very adult novel written by Mordecai Rickler, who was one of Canada's great authors. Man, I actually admire quite a bit, because I think that he did some very good commentary on sort of the nature of Canadian identity and stuff. But The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz is like this story about like a Jewish Montreal man who sort of lives a life of sort of scamming and stuff in sort of the 1940s, a very particular moment in sort of Canadian society, in Montreal society, Quebec society, Jewish Canadian identity, all of this sort of thing. It's a very sort of like sophisticated adult novel that would not make for a good children's play.
No, we're doing a child-friendly version of The Handmaid's Tale.
Ooh, I'd like to try out for Offred.
This is equally preposterous, a child-friendly version of The Handmaid's Tale. I mean, I think we all know The Handmaid's Tale by now because of the big Netflix series. The original Handmaid's Tale novel was written by Margaret Atwood, who's a very famous Canadian author, probably the most famous Canadian author of all time.
I'd like to try out for Offred.
Oh, so you're asking directly for something you want. Well, that's not very Canadian, but I like it.
I actually kind of like that joke, even though that's very stereotypical. I definitely think that there is a certain kind of Canadian who is extremely passive-aggressive in that way when it comes to wanting things. I think there is a kind of sensibility that some middle class, and especially like upper middle class Canadians are taught, where you should always sort of imply you want something rather than asking for it, which can be quite maddening in its own way because it really puts a lot of onus on the other person to kind of like read your mind and detect your sort of subtle indications of interest.
I have to get my daughter back. Can I hide in the trunk?
Okay, but don't tell anyone we're going up for beer.
We all know.
So this is a real border crossing, the Ambassador Bridge, which connects Detroit to Windsor, Ontario. I believe it's the single busiest border crossing in the entire US-Canada border. So if I have this right, the drinking age in every Canadian province is lower than the drinking age in every American state. This is often imagined to be a national policy in both countries, but it's actually a local policy in both places. The fact that every American state has a drinking age of 21 has something to do with highway legislation that was implemented by Elizabeth Dole when she was Secretary of Transportation, if I recall correctly. But there is some variation of drinking age between the Canadian provinces, although only by like a year or two.
What's this blue stuff, eh? Oh, it's called a cartail. Stupid new American fad. Oh, we'll get it in 6 months. Move along.
If anything, I would say that that is a little generous to Canada.
Goodbye.
So this is what I would think of as being like a very traditional kind of old-fashioned house that you sometimes see in Eastern Canada. I don't really know a lot about architecture, so somebody else can tell me like what this style is, but I really remember seeing houses like this when I was in Toronto or Montreal. And in this little sign here, it says, "Give us your Alec Baldwins, your Lena Dunhams, yearning to breathe free." And this is a reference to the idea that, you know, every time a Republican gets elected, there's always a bunch of liberal celebrities like Alec Baldwin and Lena Dunham who are like, "We're gonna move to Canada." Has any celebrity ever moved to Canada is a good question. Most celebrities move out of Canada in reality.
Oh, sweetie. This is the best hug we've ever had.
Yes, it's wonderful. Please don't make me leave.
Your home is with us, not them.
This is interesting. This is a very sort of subtle joke here. The carpet here is done up in the style of the logo of the Quebec City Nordiques, which is a sort of dead hockey team. Oh, and I just noticed this now, and the lamp in the background is the Stanley Cup. Oh, and here's another little subtle thing. Very eagle-eyed here. You can see they have a framed picture of the CN Tower in the background. The iconic Toronto landmark.
I'm really gonna miss this place.
If it makes you feel any better, Canada exploits its environment too.
What?
This country does it all. Tar sands, strip mining, mountain walking, geese goosing, French fried gravying.
So, you know, much of this episode is obviously based on the premise that sort of Canada is this very liberal country in contrast to the United States, and that somebody like Lisa would sort of idolize Canada and want to live there, yada yada, which is, you know, a trope that is common on the US left. But there has been some growing pushback to that, in part led by left-wing Canadians themselves. And one of the sort of self-criticisms that left-wing Canadians often bring up when they're trying to sort of say, you know, Canada's not all that great, is this kind of stuff about the environment. Canada has an economy, both historically and in the present day, that has been, you know, heavily based around the exploitation of natural resources. The carbon footprint produced by the Canadian oil and mining sector in particular is extremely high. I believe that Canada has one of the highest rates of CO2 emissions per capita of any country in the world. And if you heard, she also said geese goosing,
Mountain walking, geese goosing.
which may or may not be a reference to the Canadian goose jacket industry, the often cruel way that geese are defeathered in order to make winter coats is another thing that's become increasingly controversial in this country.
Okay, but I'm sure you treat all peoples equally.
Except the Quebecois and the Newfies.
Stupid newfies.
Okay, so I get what they're trying to say here, but I don't know if this is the angle I would have necessarily taken in making this particular argument. Like, I think that most people would agree that, yes, Canada does have problems with discrimination and bigotry and inequality and this sort of thing, but I don't know if the best examples to cite of who is sort of on the receiving end of that would be the Quebecers and the Newfoundlanders. I think if most people were asked to identify, like, who are the truly disadvantaged, discriminated against groups in modern Canada, people would say, like, you know, people of color, Indigenous Canadians, and so on. But that said, you know, this does get at something a little bit more meta. I wrote a piece for the Washington Post a while ago talking about how there still do exist groups of, you know, white people in Canada who very much sort of conceptualize themselves as being a minority equivalent to like a racial minority. There are lots of French Canadians who conceptualize themselves this way and will speak of like anti-French attitudes as being racist, for instance. And the Newfoundlanders also have a sort of curious understanding of what exactly they are, which leads into this controversial next segment.
Quebecois and the Newfies.
Stupid newfies.
I'm a newfie. Whee! I guess that does make me feel a little better.
So this sequence was controversial in Newfoundland itself for a number of reasons. The main one is just, of course, that Newfoundlanders do not like being portrayed as dummies, which is why the decision to make Ralph Wiggum their representative was a little intentionally provocative. The other thing was using the term Newfie. In recent years, the Newfoundlanders have really tried to make this term understood as a slur, like a deeply offensive, bigoted statement. I've seen some people dragooned into apologizing after using it publicly. This gets into the idea that some Newfoundlanders really sort of think of themselves as like a minority, and thus entitled to the sort of social protections that racial and religious minorities get. It always strikes me as a little overwrought. Like Newfie you could sort of say as a term like hick or redneck or something. Like in my opinion, I don't know if I would say that this really rises to the level of something that should be that offensive. And then there's this part where he beats up the seal, which is an allusion to the Newfoundland sealing industry. There are a fair number of Newfoundlanders who are employed in what is, I think, quite widely regarded as quite a barbaric industry of clubbing seals in order to harvest their meat and fur. There is not actually a lot of market demand for seal fur and meat these days, so this is an industry that is very heavily subsidized by the government. But a lot of Newfoundlanders are very defensive about it, and to some degree this has become a sort of culture war issue in Canada. You know, it's like, are you on the side of these proud, white, blue-collar, hard-working Canadians just trying to make a living, doing the thing that they've done for 100 years? Or are you on the side of the effete, urban, progressive vegetarians who are afraid of a little animal blood?
Where the wind blows cold and there's ice and snow, some days go on forever.
I'm not actually sure what that song is. The Newfoundlanders are also sort of famous for having a lot of folk music, so I think that's what that's supposed to be an allusion to. If you actually know what that song is, let me know. It's certainly, I wouldn't say, a well-known Canadian song. Coming soon, Julian Assange. No, that first building was actually what the Canadian Supreme Court looks like, so again, a good attention to detail.
Our top story tonight, Estranged Brew.
So, this is a reference to the movie Strange Brew, which starred Bob and Doug McKenzie, these characters from a comedy show that was on in the, I guess in the 1970s. This is them here, I think, Bob and Doug McKenzie.
Marge Simpson and her daughter have now been banned from the United States, just like asbestos. This just in, asbestos is back into America's hospitals and schools.
I don't know if this was intentional or not, but that is perhaps a reference to another sort of famous Canadian sin, which is the degree that we are one of the biggest asbestos-producing nations in the world. So anyway, Marge continues to persuade Lisa to come back to America, which triggers this little sequence where she looks over at Detroit with her thing of Molson's Junior beer, a reference to Molson Canadian, very iconic Canadian beer company. And all of her American heroes, including the Jeopardy-playing robot in Louis Armstrong, emerge to remind her of what makes America great, and she realizes the error of her ways.
Get your ass back over here.
Yes, sir, Satchmo. America ain't perfect, but it's my job to make it better. See you soon.
What are you going over there for?
It's legal.
what is past the Dutch.
I feel like this particular gag is getting increasingly out of date with each passing year as more and more states legalize marijuana in their own right.
We will get you across the river. Nous allons vous faire traverser la rivière. God, you waste so much time saying everything twice.
I agree, official bilingualism is bad.
We must ditch our excess cargo. You two.
You're abandoning us in the middle of a frozen river? Wow, Canadians really can be jerks.
Yes, for every Martin Short, there is no shortage of Shatners.
I'm sure I don't need to explain that one to you. Martin Short, one of Canada's most beloved actors, versus William Shatner, one of Canada's least beloved, or at least in some ways most infamous. But then in the end, Homer comes to save the day, and a grateful Lisa returns home to Springfield.
Now can we do Duddy Kravitz? No, we're gonna watch an episode of The Beachcombers.
The Beachcombers was, I think, Canada's longest running television show. It was about like lumberjacks in British Columbia or something. I actually don't know anything about it. All right, and we are done. So I would give this episode a soft 5. It is obvious that a lot of effort has been put into researching Canadian stuff in order to ensure the episode is filled with lots of in-jokes and references that would both be amusing to audiences in this country, while also presenting Canada as a more fully rounded place than what you sometimes see in other pop culture portrayals. And I think the episode deserves credit for at least attempting to push back against the Canada is a liberal utopia stereotype that has obviously been gaining traction in America for quite some time. Clearly reached a peak during the Trump years, which is obviously what this episode is in conversation with. But, you know, at the end of the day, I just really don't feel like I find this style of gawking at the other type of humor all that amusing. To pull it off effectively, I really think you have to strike a delicate balance between getting some things right and some things spectacularly, flamboyantly wrong on purpose. And I'm not really sure if this episode does that. I thought the one where the family went to Britain was much better in this sense, but then again, maybe I'm just too close to the source material in this case. Now, I know that these sort of so-and-so reacts type videos are all the rage on YouTube these days. Lawyer reacts, doctor reacts, therapist reacts, former baby reacts, and so on. If you would like to see me give more of my unique blend of Canadian analysis to another depiction of Canada and pop culture, let me know in the comments below, and I will see you next week.
But I'm warm and fed in a Newfoundlander's bed. I'll be an islander forever. I'll be an islander forever.
Hello friends, my name is JJ. So, one of the things you should know about us Canadians is that we really like to talk about Canada. Since Canadians know that the rest of the world doesn't really know that much about Canada, this often results in Canadians having a kind of obnoxious over-eagerness to tell foreigners about our country. And when Canadians talk about Canada, they have a tendency to do it in this very patronizing, propagandistic sort of way. Canadians often like to take advantage of the ignorance of foreigners to plant a very flattering image of Canada in their minds. I call this the can-splainer phenomenon. This, I think, is one of the reasons why so many international stereotypes of Canada tend to be based around very positive things, like Canadians being very polite or having very clean, safe cities. A lot of these cliches are things we made up about ourselves. Anyway, the other end of this phenomenon is that Canadians often get very defensive and hypercritical when they hear someone else try to can-splain. It's sort of like being in the car with a bad driver. It provokes a sort of, I could do this so much better anxiety. So today I thought I would show you this phenomenon in action by getting me, one of YouTube's most beloved can-splainers, to react to a recent can-splainer video that was put out by the popular clickbait channel Grunge. It is entitled Things You Should Absolutely Never Do in Canada. So let us take a watch and see how triggering I find it.
The USA's northern neighbor is a popular tourist destination for many Americans, but it isn't the same as the States. Despite Canada's reputation for politeness, there are some buttons you don't want to push. If you go to Canada, do not make fun of the way they talk. When people put on a fake Canadian accent as a joke, it's not even an accurate accent. It's some antiquated and exaggerated version of how some Canadians might have spoken a long, long time ago. So seriously, lay off the aboot stuff or you'll risk suffering the wrath of an angry Canadian.
So I would say that this is broadly true, but maybe not for quite the same reasons. I think that a lot of Canadians are in a fair bit of denial over the fact that they do, in fact, have accents, and it is, in fact, quite easy for a lot of Americans to tell that you're from Canada just by listening to you talk. Many Canadians, particularly those who live in big cities, have really bought into this idea that Canadians speak a very plain and generic and clean form of English, and the whole idea of a distinctive Canadian accent is just some mean-spirited American myth. I think a lot of this stems from a desire to have Canada taken seriously as a country and not dismissed as some wilderness, redneck, hillbilly place. And unfortunately, a lot of people across North America associate having a strong accent with being very poor and hickish. It is quite revealing, in fact, that many Canadians will quite quickly concede that strong accents do exist in some parts of the country, just the really backwards, rural places. Other Canadians sometimes give me a hard time because, of course, I have a very strong way of